Hello, I'm John Scowcroft, Executive Advisor at the Global CCS Institute, and I'd like to give a big welcome to our international audience because we have attendees at this webinar from all around the globe. And today we're going to look at the Global Status of CCS 2014 and with particular emphasis on overcoming the challenges in Europe. Now let me kick off and introduce our presenter, Andrew Purvis. Andy joined the Institute in September 2013 following a career in the global steel industry. Before joining the Institute, he spent 5 years working in the BlueScope Steel in Australia as Vice President Environment, where he was responsible for environmental performance and greenhouse policy, and he was also managed BlueScope Steel's input to the Australian government's climate change policy. I'd now like to introduce our panel to you. Our panelists are Kirsty Anderson, Public Engagement, and in keeping with the international flavour of this thing, she's in Glasgow. Here in Brussels, we have Silvia Vaghi, Policy and Regulation Specialist, Guido Magneschi, who is doing capture, and in Melbourne, we have Consoli, who's dealing with storage. We will have questions after the presentation, and you're all invited to submit questions throughout the presentation using the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. The questions will be moderated and posed at the end of the presentation. It's probable that we won't be able to answer all the questions today. However, we will endeavour to get through as many as possible in this session. And now, without further ado, let me hand over to Andrew Purvis.
Thank you, John. As John explained, I'm Andy Purvis. I'm the General Manager for the Europe, Middle East and Africa region with the Institute. And I'm going to be presenting the status report to you this morning, or today. For those of you who may not be so familiar with the Global CCS Institute, we are an international membership organization. We have a global reach with offices in Washington, Brussels, Beijing and Tokyo, and we are headquartered in Melbourne. We have a diverse international membership which consists of governments, global corporations and the private sector, small companies, research bodies and non-government organizations, and we have specialist expertise, as will be seen in the panel list today, which covers the entire CCUS chain. For those who are not so familiar with our mission, we are very clear on what we're here for, which is to accelerate or promote and accelerate the deployment of CCS as a solution to the climate issue. It's really important to contextualize why carbon capture and storage matters, and largely that's the story of where energy comes from and where energy goes to. And the charts that I have on the screen now really tell the story. The reserves to production ratio for fossil fuels is 75 years, and it's been consistent for decades. As soon as we use fuel, we find more. Primary energy demand has soared from the graphs from the IEA you see there from 1990 to 2010. However, despite massive investment and subsidy of renewables, the ratio of fossil fuels as part of the whole has stayed the same. And looking forward, with the IEA predictions to 2035, you see there's not a huge change in the proportion of energy demand globally that comes from fossil fuel. So fossil fuels aren't going away. This is why we really need to move forward with carbon capture and storage. CCS is widely recognized as being a vital element of a low carbon energy future. There's some numbers here from the International Energy Agency which set out their scenarios looking forward to 2050 over what abatement would be required and where it will come from to enable us to hit 450 parts per million and stay on the 2 degrees pathway. In this modeling, CCS comes out as delivering 14% of the total. A huge change in the way we generate electricity and use electricity is going to be needed. And it isn't purely CCS advocates who are saying this. Over really recent months, there's been a number of independent bodies and independent voices who don't have a vested interest in the issue, stating how this is and making the case for CCS. You can't overstate the IPCC fifth assessment report. Many of the models they used could not deliver atmospheric concentration levels of 450 without key technologies which include CCS. I'll come back to that. The Energy Modeling Forum said that the unavailability of carbon capture and storage and limited availability for bioenergy have the largest impact on the costs of stabilizing atmospheric emissions. IEA summarized it very well for Maria van der Hoeven. We need to shift to a higher gear in developing CCS to a true energy option to develop at large scale. It's not enough to see CCS in long-term scenarios as a solution that happens in the future. We need to get to CCS deployment right now. Let's go back for a moment to the IPCC report. This is a table that was included in the report, and it was possibly overlooked by many. I mean, the main message of this slide is that of the 11 models that they looked at, the 11 robust models, without CCS in the mix, more than half of the models, 7 out of 11, wouldn't solve and said that 450 is not achievable. Those that would solve came to the conclusion that the extra cost of delivering 450 parts per million and 2 degrees C without CCS was 138% more. This compares to 7% without nuclear, 6% with limited solar and wind, and 64% without limited bioenergy. So the message here really is that CCS may be an essential element. It's not just about cost. Without CCS, this may be impossible. If we look at where CCS projects are happening around the world, it's clear that North America leads the way again. There are 9 operational projects in the United States. There are 26 projects in total. China is coming in second, and China really is a remarkable story in terms of growth. China has come from nowhere 3 or 4 years ago to where they are now with 12 projects, and we anticipate that of these projects, some will move to final investment decision over the next 12 months. Europe is challenging, and Europe it is really a continent of 2 halves. On the European mainland, other than the 2 operating Norwegian projects, there's only 1 project, which is the Dutch road project. In the UK, things are a little more active, and it's probably important to pay tribute to the government of the UK, who have made a clear commitment to CCS and backed that with real money and real policy action. And this probably accounts for the greatest reason we have for optimism within this region. The Gulf Cooperation Council also warrants mention. The Institute recently held our international members meeting in Abu Dhabi. There are 2 projects in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates and also in Saudi Arabia. So these have quickly moved into contention, and having seen how things are changing in that region, there's, I think, good cause for optimism that more projects will emerge. In the rest of the world, there are 7 projects in development, 2 in operation. So overall, I believe there are good reasons to be positive around CCS. In many ways, the discussion around CCS is framed in the context of it's all about enhanced oil recovery, isn't it? Well, I think as this slide shows, looking back at existing projects, this possibly has been arguable up to now. Of the geological storage projects that exist, they're actually all been in our region, in Sleipner, in Salar and Snovid. However, looking forward, the option of dedicated geological storage is becoming more apparent. If we look forward at the projects that are currently under construction, the Illinois Industrial Project, the Gorgon Project in Australia, and the Quest Project in Canada are all proposing to use dedicated geological storage. And it's also worth knowing that Boundary Dam, and noting that Boundary Dam, while an EOR project, it also has an element of geological storage. Looking forward, we are at the projects which are under advanced planning. We're starting to see more dedicated geological storage. And in fact, the trend seems to move towards geological storage. And it's worth noting that this is really only possible because of the learnings that we've achieved through the rollouts of CCUS and capture to be used in enhanced oil recovery. It's also worth reviewing the pathway. How did we get to where we are? I believe, and the Institute believes, that we are currently looking at a watershed year for CCS. Decisions that were taken at the start of the decade by far-sighted investors and companies based on positive policy frameworks put in place by governments to encourage the pursuit of CCS. There is a portfolio of CCS projects up to 2020, a significant lineup of 14 projects, and over the next 12 to 24 months, these projects will be taking final investment decisions, and they'll need supporting environment, and a business case to make that positive decision. Policy is going to be key to realize that. However, from there's a need to massively increase adoption of the technology if we're going to meet the objectives of the IPCC, and to really take advantage of the abatement opportunities that CCS offers, to take advantage of the emission reductions and accommodating growth in energy consumption. This will all happen for good reasons. We need to bring people out of energy poverty while managing global emissions. Decisions that have been taken now will set the policy, the legal and the infrastructure foundations for the post-2020 portfolio. It's really important that decisions are taken now if we're going to realize the potential that we have. Let's take a look around the regions of the world in which we operate. As was clear from one of my earlier slides, North America is still very much leading the way. North America does have over half of the large-scale projects globally that are in operation or under construction. North America is also home to three of the world's large-scale CCS power projects in operation or construction. Recently, we saw the launch of Boundary Dam, which was a huge event for the global CCS community. It's certainly true that in the United States, CO2 EOR is providing significant business case support for these early projects. Policy actions and incentives to drive CCS deployment must complement the action that's been taken from a regulatory perspective in the States on setting emissions performance standard. Probably also worth paying tribute to the US DOE R&D program. This is one of the world's most significant research programs that's really supporting deployment of these technologies in the United States. In South America, Brazil and Mexico are advancing their own programs. So really the Americas is starting to look like the complete package in terms of CCS deployment. In Asia Pacific, as I've touched on, we've really seen the emergence of China. It's the most active country after North America, the United States, and CCS and CCS US. However, Asia Pacific is bigger than China. The world's largest dedicated geological storage project, which is the Gorgon carbon dioxide injection project in Australia, is planned to be operational in 2016. Both Japan and Korea have CCS activities underway, both at a pilot and demonstration scale. In Japan, the Tokamakoi and Osaki Coolgen projects are in construction. And in Korea, KEPCO is testing advanced capture technologies. And there's also a key focus on storage potential and increasing knowledge of storage potential in the region. In some areas, there are there is a need for legal and regulatory advances to provide greater certainty to those looking to develop projects. I also touched on the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf. These countries are at an early stage of CCUS deployment. However, it's a very interesting and fast emerging region. There are 2 projects underway, one in Saudi Arabia and one in the United Arab Emirates. The UAE project is particularly significant as it represents the world's first CCS and CCUS project in the iron and steel sector. The focus of CCS and CCUS activity in the region is twofold: to validate those large-scale projects under local conditions and provide support for R&D. And the confidence that will be gained from these projects is really a significant long-term driver going forward. If we look at Europe, I think it's fair to say that Europe, from the perspective of Europeans in general terms, has been disappointing. There was huge ambition at the start of the decade to realize CCS. This hasn't been delivered. There's been no new project in Europe entering construction in a decade. However, as a result of, and in tribute to, I think, a number of high-profile advocates for CCS in Europe who really never let the ambition slip, we are seeing progress. Explicit recognition of CCS in the October 2014 European Council conclusions was a very positive sign of support. I think that's the first time in 6 years that CCS has been referenced in the conclusions of the European Council. We're seeing progress in the UK. CCS projects there are progressing. Policymakers are developing mechanisms to support CCS, both in the power but also in the industrial sectors. Another interesting aspect about Europe is that all the projects in planning in this region are planning to use geological storage, either in depleted gas fields or in dedicated deep saline formations. This is important and will lead to significant learning from a global perspective. The Dutch project, the road project in Rotterdam, is important. It's vitally important that that project is able to take a positive financial decision. And really the only issue for that project is money. So really would encourage any organization and any government who wants to see CCS develop to consider lending a hand to that vitally important project. If we look at some of the individual elements in the chain, to begin with capture. Really the main issue here is cost and reducing the cost of capture. First generation projects will deliver really important lessons on capture technology. In terms of continued R&D, this is important, and this will focus on materials, process, and equipment, all to drive down cost, and collaboration is going to be crucial among actors in the chain to achieve cost and performance goals. We know cost reduction is achievable. We know that SAS Power have told us that from their learning from developing Boundary Dam, if they do that again, and when they do that again, the second unit will be developed or will be delivered at 25% lower cost. This is tremendously important and shows the value of learning by doing. Next generation technologies need to be ready for that vital rollout in 2020 to 2025. Storage, the issue is timing. It's clear that EOR has provided vital support to the current wave of CCS projects that are in the portfolio or in advanced planning. I showed a little bit earlier, geological storage is coming, and really global deployment will require significant geological storage. Within the 2-degree scenario, we're going to require 2 gigatons of annual storage by 2030, 7 gigatons by 2050. This is more than we're going to be able to deliver using enhanced oil recovery alone. So geological storage is going to be essential. And greenfield sites can take up to 10 years to assess to get to a final investment decision standard. It's very important that we don't rush this activity. This has to be done properly if scientifically rigorously if public support for CCS is going to be maintained. Currently, it's difficult to see why industry should undertake storage exploration for pure storage terms, so there is a need for policy to deliver that. Another element is policy and regulatory. You can't deny CCS costs more than unabated energy. However, low carbon energy costs more than unabated energy. And as the slide I showed earlier demonstrated very clearly, without CCS, the total bill globally to decarbonize, if it's possible at all, is significantly higher. The current large-scale CCS project activity is largely supported by public funding programs that were established toward the end of the last decade. This isn't universally the case, and the UK probably stands out as the exception. But this is largely the case now. So looking forward, we need to have a policy, a legal and regulatory environment that will incentivize investment in CCS and provide predictability for investors in CCS projects. We need to take action right now if we're going to continue to deliver projects into the next decade. In that context, the new international climate change agreement, which is currently in development, is going to be a very important foundation stone. The UNFCCC need to recognize CCS. Regional and national policy settings need to be technology neutral to enable CCS to deliver. It's interesting to look at investment over the last 10 years in CCS and other renewables and clean energy technology. This is data that's been sourced from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it really demonstrates what can be done with supportive policy. Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen almost $2 trillion, $2,000 billion worth of investment into renewables. Over the same period, $20 billion of investment into CCS. CCS has not enjoyed commensurate policy support with renewables. And while EORs provided that impetus in North America, policy parity is going to be essential. And I think the challenge for all of us is how do we get CCS onto that same curve? If we look at points and recommendations for decision makers, near-term policy support is critical to move those advanced projects that we have into construction. This is particularly telling within the European perspective. There's a project in the Netherlands which is ready to go. It's shovel ready. It's ready to take a final investment decision. The only issue they have there is closing a financial gap which has been incurred largely because of reduction in carbon prices within the EU. The road project is vitally important and has the potential to be the European Union's boundary dam that demonstrates to the public and to policymakers that CCS can be real, that CCS on power can be real. Boundary dam is important, but it's also important that we see these projects developing around the regions to be relevant and locally relevant. Investors need confidence. We need strong and sustainable emission reduction policies that can give investors confidence to invest in CCS in the long term. These policies must be technology neutral and treat all low energy solutions equally. We need programs that encourage exploration of storage resources. We talked about storage and the fact that we need to really understand the potential for underground storage and support timely development, and this can take a long time. It's not something that can be or should be rushed. If public support and scientific integrity is to be maintained, both of these are crucial. This isn't a developed world issue. Substantial emission reductions are going to be required in non-OECD countries. There needs to be focused effort from the global community to really look at increasing project activity within these economies. Final point is that a lot of the time, the discussion around CCS is framed in the context sector. The power is important. However, there are other industrial processes such as iron, steelmaking, and cement in which you cannot decarbonize without CCS. It is simply not possible to make virgin iron and steel without releasing carbon dioxide. It's part of the chemical process. Urgent attention must be paid to policies that really incentivize the deployment of CCS and the development of infrastructure to facilitate the deployment of CCS within these industries. So how do we close? We close with a call to action from all of us who believe that CCS is an important part of the clean energy future and needs to play a role. It's tremendously exciting to be able to say that CCS in the power sector is now a reality. The argument that CCS is unproven is experimental. Fiction can be clearly and finally is real. It's operating right now. We have projects than ever before. We have 50% more projects now in planning than we had at the start of the decade. However, the next generation of CCS needs decisions now. The challenge is for all of us to take today's messages, the messages that are contained within the Global Status of CCS reports and that I've tried to summarize in this presentation to promote CCS, and for each of us to be a voice for CCS to help promote understanding of the importance of the technology. The challenge isn't the technology. One could buy a capture plant tomorrow. There are a number of the Institute's members who will sell you capture technology off the shelf tomorrow. There are thousands of kilometers of pipelines in the United States and also in other places distributing CO2. We have been injecting CO2 into EOR and into geological storage in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea for decades. The challenge is not technology, the challenge is policy, and the challenge is support. The challenge is for governments and policymakers to put in place conditions and an environment that allows the technology to thrive. We have had significant successes in the last 12 months. The challenge for the CCS community now is to build on these recent successes. And our call to action is to do this and to accelerate CCS around the world. 2 weeks ago in Abu Dhabi, the Global CCS Institute launched our flagship publication, the Global Status of CCS 2014. I would encourage everybody listening to this webinar who has an interest in CCS to download this report. It really is our key publication. We're very proud of this publication. We think it's our best yet. The report covers global and regional policy developments in large-scale CCS, in CCS technologies, and also in the critical policy, legal, and regulatory environment. It introduces and provides links to project descriptions for around 40 notable CCS projects that perhaps haven't made the cut in terms of what we define as a large-scale demonstration project, but these projects are important. It makes recommendations for decision makers. And this year, in order to be more sustainable, the report is available online. And this includes links to supporting resources and data. And there's also available a summary document. Translations of the summary document available in a number of languages, including Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. To find the report, I would encourage you all to go to the Global CCS Institute's homepage, and you will see very clear links there to the report. I think I will close there and hand over to John.
Thank you very much for that, Andy. We're now open for questions. I've had a load of questions come in whilst Andy's been speaking, so I'll go through those, but don't let that stop you. Keep your questions coming. Right, Andy, the first question is for you. we've been talking enough, but I think this is one for you, and that is, what would be a business case for a project with geological storage? I'll let you have first go at it, and then I'll see whether Chris and Silvia will have anything to add.
I think, as I covered in the presentation, CCS is more expensive than unabated energy. CCS with geological storage is more expensive than EOR, as there isn't a business case. Even in the European Union, where we have an emissions trading scheme, carbon prices are not at a level right now to support investment in geological storage. The challenge, therefore, is with policymakers and with governments to put in place arrangements that facilitate and encourage and enable investment. We covered in the presentation that it's going to be essential in the medium to long term to develop storage potential and to enable investment in storage potential. This has to happen, and it will happen over a considerable period. I think the ball is firmly in the court of governments and regulators to put in place policy that can enable that to happen. It's telling that within the UK, the projects that are in development there are all geological storage projects, which shows that if there is a sensible and well thought out policy framework in place, it can enable private sector players to look at investing in those kind of projects. So it can happen, but it's down to governments to really put in place the frameworks and the policies to give confidence to investors to do that.
Thank you, Andy. I think that really leads me on to the next question, which I'm going to throw at Silvia, which is really exploring a bit further that element of what kind of policy support is needed. And the question is basically, what kind of policy framework do you think could ensure CCS in the EU? The questioner thinks the NER 300 400 is not enough. Could a stricter EPS, or could an EPS, some kind of market system like certificates, contracts for different CO2 tax or other ideas, work for CCS in the EU? Silvia, I think you've probably got enough there to keep going to the rest of the session.
Thank you, John. I will answer this question from a policy and regulatory viewpoint, and link with what also Andy has just mentioned, because it's true that the ETS and the current level of the carbon price continue to be almost universally judged as being insufficient to support the CCS development. And given the current carbon price, it is clear that we need supplementary measures, and we need them to drive the demonstration of CCS, because the way CCS is currently promoted in Europe needs enhancing, and this is due to, as you pointed out within the R300, also to available fund that we need to make available in the near future, because right now they are not sufficient to support an effective demonstration program. And therefore, given the CCS is currently in the pre-commercial demonstration phase, we need to support them with targeted technology policies, such as, for instance, subsidies. And whenever the technology is ready for the market uptake, we need to put in place market pull policies, such as carbon prices, that are needed to trigger the CCS deployment. And coming back to the Global CCS report and the policy, regulatory and legal chapter, which is in the report 2014, there is part of the report with a survey that has been undertaken with CCS policy project proponents that show that there are important policy enablers to bring CCS to the market. Some of them are ranked in the first category in the past years as well. Those are the access to direct subsidies, the offtake arrangement offering guaranteed prices, and efficient regulatory approval process. In Europe, of course, most of the CCS large-scale integrated projects are in the power sector and plan to use offshore geological storage. Therefore, at that viewpoint, appropriate mitigation policy settings are important. And in that regard, I'd like to link this mitigation policy setting with the technology neutral emission reduction policies. Some of them have been agreed recently in the Council conclusion, and that is a positive sign of support. With that, I'd like to close the answer, but if any detail is needed, John, just come back to me.
Okay, thank you, Silvia. Andy, another one for you. Simple one. Do cement and iron and steel industry really support CCS?
I believe the dynamics of those industries are complicated. There's a clear difference between the competitive position, for example, of the power sector and those emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries. However, I would say that I was invited as a guest of the World Steel Association to speak at their annual conference in Moscow earlier this year around CCS. The CEO of Emirates Steel, on whose plant the project in Abu Dhabi is based, made a presentation to, this is a one-day conference that's only held once a year and engages with the CEOs of the world's largest steel companies, the Mittals, the Tatas. I spoke for half an hour or so around what CCS is and how CCS could be of value to those industries, and I was pretty encouraged by the response that we got. There is real interest in the technology. It's certainly more complicated to deliver CCS in those industries compared to power. That comes back to issues of competitiveness and trade exposure. But I'm certainly encouraged by the work or the enthusiasm and the work that's been done. Pilots are under development in cement, and there's a really interesting project that's happening again in the UK in the Tees Valley region, looking at how industrial CCS can be incentivized. So it's not easy, or it would have happened already, but I have, I guess, a high degree of confidence and optimism that those industries will come to the party, and ultimately they need to.
Thank you, Andy. I've now got a question which is really on the public aspect, and it's to do with storage. And it's for Kirsty, and I think then maybe Chris would like to follow up. The question is onshore CO2 storage still not a publicly acceptable option for Europe? And I think after Kirsty's answered that from a European point of view, it'd be good to get Chris's view on what the global situation is between onshore and offshore storage. Kirsty.
Thanks, John. Yeah, well, Europe's got a bit of a history with onshore CO2 storage, and I think you heard from Andy earlier that currently none of the current active large-scale projects in Europe are looking at onshore storage. The preference is offshore, and you know there is good solid geology offshore in many areas in Europe. However, personally, I think that just saying that onshore CO2 storage is not publicly acceptable is too simplistic. It's not just about public acceptability, and I think Europe was quite strongly impacted by the public attacks that were made on the Barendrecht project in the Netherlands and the Janswalde project in Germany, which were both onshore projects. But I think in most other regions, onshore storage is actually the norm as opposed to offshore. And in Europe, there have been a number of pilot scale onshore CO2 storage projects that have generally been very well received, and currently in Hontimen in Spain, and in the public engagement chapter of the status report, you can see a case study that we did on the CO2 injection, onshore CO2 injection project in Hontimen, where they've got extremely positive public engagement. And I think really the challenge in Europe with onshore is that there's a lack of familiarity, first of all, with CCS in general, which we know, but also a lack of familiarity with onshore oil and gas extraction, which you see in many other areas. And I think in this kind of environment, it's really critical that you get that public engagement right. And it's about raising awareness, making sure that people really truly understand and are given access to all the different monitoring techniques and reassurance that is required to allow people to understand the levels of safety and assurance that we have with CO2 storage. And I think honestly that onshore CO2 storage in Europe doesn't need to be the barrier that it's sort of presented to be at the moment.
Thanks, Kirsty. Chris, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Kirsty. Exactly is my point of view that community engagement is critical. From a purely technical aspect for storing CO2, both onshore and offshore storage are both feasible. There's active projects worldwide actually injecting CO2 in both those environments, both offshore and onshore. Now, they both have very different technical challenges and environmental challenges, but onshore does have that added layer of community engagement and awareness, which really needs to be addressed. In the US and all the projects coming up in China, they are completely onshore, and they are attending those community awareness events and risks by informing the community from the ground level, the students, all the way through to the regulators and the policy advisors. But overall, we are seeing in the largely developed nations, in the European Union and in Australia, a push to offshore environment for CO2 storage. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Guido, just in case you thought we were ignoring you, I've got a question for you. It's really about capture technology development and how does Europe rank with the rest of the world, but more specifically is how would you motivate capture technology developers and providers for the second generation of technology if they couldn't really implement the first one due to a lack of projects?
Yes, thank you, John. I think that Europe has been and still is one major contributor to the development of capture technology, together with US, China, Korea, Japan, and Australia. CCS in Europe continues to receive significant funding from the European Union, the governments, and the industry. So there is still there are still things going on. However, in the last years, many demo and full-scale projects in Europe have been cancelled or put on hold, and this has also reflected as less progress achieved, of course. At the moment, there are few large-scale projects under planning or in operation in Europe. Therefore, the developments are mainly continued through fundamental research and pilot testing, rather than scaling up or operational experience at large scale. So I think Europe is still a big contributor, a big player, but we would like to see more full-scale project or demo project to build more experience and capacity at a larger scale. And for the other question, that is how we can motivate capture technology developers for the second generation. I think that there is still motivation for developers to develop newer technologies, because the goal is to reduce the cost, and there are still funding being given by government and industry to develop these newer technologies. So I think that the developers are motivated. The question maybe is if we can really implement these newer technologies in 10 or 15 years from now. And for doing that, we need a large numbers of projects in the pipeline. But of course, these technology are newer technology, are not mature already. So there is still some work to be done, and this is being done at the moment. So I think that development will be going on still for a while, at least 10 years. That's my my expectation.
Thank you, Guido. The next question I think I'd better take is what can be expected with regard to CCS support from the next Paris UNFCCC conference? I'll try and be brief on this one. I think the Paris Agreement, for which there isn't any text yet, is likely to be a broad enabling agreement, and I don't really expect to see very much in detail in it about technologies. But I think it's important to recognize that CCS is already recognized within the UNFCCC regime. It is specifically mentioned in the Kyoto Protocol as an appropriate technology. It has been recognized as an appropriate technology under the Clean Development Mechanism. And although the Clean Development Mechanism is generally regarded as being something that is on its last legs, it is important to recognize it will form the format for any new market mechanisms that come about. So the fact that it is recognized in the CDM is important. Equally, the last negotiating meeting in October held a specific workshop on CCS, which the Institute contributed to. It was a very successful workshop, and it's clear that the negotiators have begun to realize that along with renewables energy efficiency, CCS is one of the technologies that's got an important role to play. Equally, the technology mechanism and the finance mechanism both recognize CCS as appropriate technologies. And one of the things I think will come out of the Paris Agreement will be an emphasis on ensuring that those two mechanisms talk to each other, that the technology and the finance people talk to each other, and that they begin to look for projects in the developing world to go forward. Equally, a part of the technology mechanism is called the Clean Technology Center and Network, and that is designed specifically to give advice to developing countries on technologies. And the Institute is a member of the network, and basically when anyone raises questions on CCS in the procedure, they will come to us. So I think CCS is, as it were, may not be a headline in the agreement, but it is certainly firmly embedded in the process. And I think, the objective in Paris would ensure that that remains the case. Right. Now, we have another question for Kirsty. The report talks about working in collaboration with groups outside the CCS industry. Why is this important?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so the status report itself, we actually feature an article for the second year running on the importance of collaboration with groups outside of the CCS industry. And I think it's a kind of common theme in a lot of the messaging that the Institute puts out, but also a lot of the discussions that you'll hear within environmental NGO groups as well, is this real focus on not just talking to ourselves. And I think it's been something that within the CCS industry we've been pretty guilty of. Interestingly, this year in the status report, we featured, last year we did a feature on working with environmental NGOs. This year we looked at working with trusted groups such as local councils or local governments for CCS projects to work with them. And there was a number of projects when we did our project survey who fed back that working with local councils to try and improve awareness and understanding of CCS and climate change within communities was actually really key, and they had a very important role and function to play in that public engagement process. I think I'd recommend taking a look at that section of the report for projects that are starting in the early stages of their engagement work, because I think there's some really useful public engagement lessons have been learned. Also, interestingly though, the other area that we focused on was looking at not just who projects could work with, but also what other areas of communication we could learn from. And we did a small feature on the learning from climate change communication. And I think from a communication point of view on CCS, there was some really vital lessons could be learned from climate communication and from climate risk communication, where they've had to learn the lessons the hard way, basically. And some of the feedback that we got from looking at that area was this idea of, in our communication on carbon capture and storage, we want to not just always be presenting these negative, difficult challenges, but actually looking at setting CCS in this positive context, that it is a really vital and important mitigation technology, and really making clear to people that this is a positive thing for our energy mix if we're able to have a technology which can improve fossil fuel usage, as fossil fuel usage is going to be part of a future energy mix for some time to come. So it was really encouraging that shift and that change of emphasis on how we position and how we describe CCS to people who are coming in touch with it for the first time.
Thanks, Kirsty. Another one for you, Guido. Except for H2 production, Quest, for example, pre-combustion capture seems to have lost interest versus post-combustion, Boundary Dam, for example, and oxy-combustion, future gen and White Rose. What's your view in terms of future capture cost and competitiveness potential? There's a question for you.
Yes, I think that with the exception of US, in fact, pre-combustion is less applied and considered technology. But this probably also for the fact that it's the less suitable for retrofitting, while post-combustion and oxy-combustion can be easily retrofitted to an existing plant. So, and that's probably the case for Europe. In terms of cost, competitiveness potential, I think that probably there is more effort in reducing cost on post-combustion and oxy-combustion technologies, and less effort, in my opinion, is put in pre-combustion technology. So I would expect that in the future we probably see oxy-combustion and post-combustion more competitive with respect to pre-combustion. That's that would be my guess.
Thank you, Guido. I've got time for a couple more questions. Here's one for you, Silvia. Solar power and other renewables are growing faster than the IEA has predicted. How will this affect the development of CCS?
Thank you, John, for the questions. This is actually a good question because currently the activity on the policy side and the regulatory side on renewable energies, as well as the impact of renewable energies on the low carbon energy mix of the different technologies available is important. So when we come to the development of low carbon technologies, what we say as the Institute is that we would like to see a technology neutral policy framework for all technologies to be deployed. So your question is relevant to the fact that today, when we look at the Institute submission on the CCS directive, for instance, or our cooperation in the international dimension, we look into what the CCS technology would be deployed in the future in a technology neutral framework. In that regard, actually, what I would like to mention as well is what happened recently at the European Head of State that have agreed last October on the 2030 Climate and Energy Policy Framework for the European Union. And in that aspect, linking to NER 300 as well, it is important for CCS because the Council conclusion include the renewal of the NER of the new entrant self-funding program, the NER 400. And CCS has been explicitly mentioned in the text. Now, in addition, there are other two features of the Council conclusion which are relevant from CCS technology perspective. And one of these is linked to renewable energy targets. As you know, there is a target establishing no binding targets for renewable energy at national level. And from the EU perspective, the EU target corresponds to 27% of share renewables consuming at EU level only. And the fact that the renewable energy and as well as the energy efficiency target will not be translated into national binding targets implies that each member state is given enough flexibility to choose its own way for a cost-effective manner to achieve greenhouse gas reduction. And that said, by the way, it has to be noted that CCS is currently in the pre-commercial demonstration phase, which is not the case for other technologies. And the volume of public money appears to be insufficient to encourage support for deployment of a critical mass of projects, which are needed to the let alone uptake of the technology. Therefore, grants to offset capital costs, for instance, and as I mentioned in the previous question, subsidies type of measures are to be put in place to move the project in advanced stage of planning into the construction in a shorter term, which is needed for Europe.
Thank you, Silvia. Well, I think we're not going to be able to get through all the questions we've got because it's now time to close. So if you do have questions, please submit them to the Institute through the webinar inbox, which is webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website along with a copy of the presentation fairly shortly. Lastly, two things. First of all, I'd like to thank Andy and the panelists for their excellent responses. And for you who are listening to us, as you leave the session, we've put together a very quick 3-question survey and would really appreciate you taking the time to complete it, which would help us improve our webinar program. I hope you found the webinar useful and valuable. And once again, thank you all for your attendance and goodbye.